On April 30, 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the rapidly advancing North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, bringing a dramatic end to the two-decade-long conflict in Vietnam. As North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the city and helicopters hurriedly evacuated the last Americans, the world witnessed the abrupt end of a 20-year war that cost millions of lives. It was this very day that marked the defeat of US-backed South Vietnam and the victory of North Vietnam, uniting the country under communist rule. One of the most chaotic scenes of the entire conflict, this event would trigger one of the largest and long-lasting refugee crises in history, with estimates claiming millions of displaced Vietnamese. For many, it was the beginning of exile, trauma, and a completely new life. For those who supported the communist forces, it was a day of liberation and celebration. After a lengthy and costly intervention, the Vietnam War would reshape U.S. foreign policy and leave a legacy that still echoes through history, politics, and culture today. This story marks not only the end of a brutal war, but also a defining moment for a generation. The Vietnam War was a critical battleground of the Cold War between the United States and the Communist Soviet Union. Following World War II, Vietnam fought for independence from French colonial rule during the First Indochina War from 1946 until 1954. After the Vietnamese achieved decisive victory over the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 Geneva Accords temporarily divided the country at the 17th parallel into Communist North Vietnam and pro-Western South Vietnam. Beginning in 1955, civil war erupted as the two sides vied for nation unification under their respective political ideologies. From 1955 to 1964, the United States supported South Vietnam with aid in the form of weapons, supplies, and military advisors. For those 9 years, the U.S. government under Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy pondered the idea of placing combat troops on the ground with the goal of preserving South Vietnamese sovereignty in the name of the domino effect, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, the neighboring countries would quickly follow. It would not be until 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident prompted U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson to deploy U.S. combat forces in South Vietnam. Despite the massive military commitment, U.S. forces failed to make decisive gains in South Vietnam throughout the 1960s. They were unprepared for the jungle terrain, guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, and their unwavering resistance. The Vietnam War was the first U.S. military conflict to be widely televised. Graphic footage of the fighting strongly contributed to mounting anti-war sentiments across the country. By 1968, public support for the war had sharply declined. In 1969, newly elected President Richard Nixon introduced Vietnamization, a policy sought to gradually withdraw U.S. military presence in the region while also building up the South Vietnamese military to assume combat responsibilities. After more than 8 years of direct military involvement and an additional 12 years of military advising, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of 1973 between the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. This effectively removed U.S. forces from South Vietnam in an effort to promote peace. Despite the presence of U.S. aid in the form of weapons and supplies, the South Vietnamese Army, also known as the ARVN, were left to fight for themselves, as conflict between North and South Vietnam continued. The withdrawal of U.S. troops was the moment the Communist forces had been patiently waiting for, finally having their chance to strike. With the United States' departure in March of 1973, it was largely the ARVN pitted against the formidable and determined North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front, the Communist guerrilla forces in South Vietnam, famously known as the Viet Cong. Going into April of 1975, the Communist North had the objective of capturing Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, by the end of the month. City after city, including those that saw fierce battle earlier in the war, such as Hue and Da Nang, fell, as the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong made their way to Saigon. With the growing communist advance and a lack of morale, many ARVN troops deserted. Although a prevalent concern throughout the duration of the war, in the pivotal hours of the nation's sovereignty, troops were desperately needed. In just 9 days, South Vietnam saw 3 different presidents. Long-term President Nguyen Van Thu, who served from 1967 all the way up until 9 days before the country capitulated. Vice President Tran Van Hung assumed the position next, but would only serve for 1 week, until he assigned the position to Duong Van Minh. Van Minh made a last-ditch effort to negotiate peace, but he would officially be the last president of South Vietnam. While U.S. officials were able to sense the capitulation of the South Vietnamese capital several days, and even potentially months before, U.S. intelligence underestimated the speed of the collapse and the evacuation efforts were held off in anticipation of a possible resolution between the two sides. Evacuation plans were being finalized just days before the fall of the city. U.S. President at the time, Gerald Ford, pleaded with Congress to give extra aid to South Vietnam, but was rejected. On April 29, just 1 day before South Vietnam fell to the Communists, the United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, with the objective of evacuating all United States personnel, such as diplomatic staff, CIA agents, Marine Guards, and at-risk South Vietnamese in the city by helicopter only. Just 2 days before the final evacuation, the Tan Son Nhat airport was shelled and became inaccessible. Evacuation began using fixed-wing aircrafts, but once the airport came under attack, U.S. officials made helicopters the primary method for evacuation in Operation Frequent Wind. As news spread of the rapidly advancing North Vietnamese army, tens of thousands of South Vietnamese flooded the streets of Saigon in efforts to reach the U.S. Embassy and other evacuation zones. As panic spread, people abandoned their homes, jobs, and families, bringing only what they could carry. They believed that being left behind meant imprisonment, or even loss of life. In the weeks and months leading up to the final evacuation, the U.S. government had already begun evacuation efforts to assist over 130,000 South Vietnamese civilians escape the inevitable collapse of the country. Operation Baby Lift took place just 3 weeks before the fall of the Saigon, in which 3,000 South Vietnamese orphans were evacuated to the United States and other nations. Sadly, the first flight crashed, with 138 people losing their lives. Despite this, the operation continued to rescue thousands of orphans, who would be adopted abroad. Although the early evacuation efforts reduced the burden of Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation and fall of the city still proved to be disastrous. The U.S. Embassy became the focal point of the evacuation. As the Communist forces got deeper and deeper into South Vietnam's Saigon, thousands of desperate South Vietnamese rushed the gates of the embassy and gathered outside the fence, begging for entry and a trip out of, not only the city, but the entire country. Marines were required to hold back the crowds, even occasionally firing warning shots into the air. Some civilians even tried to scale the walls, climb trees, and forge documents to gain entry. In just 24 hours, over 7,000 U.S. personnel were evacuated from Saigon, solely by helicopter. Helicopters would fly to the rooftops of the embassy and other locations in the city every few minutes, day and night. Evacuees were taken to U.S. Navy ships in the South China Sea where pilots push empty fuel-drained helicopters overboard after each landing in order to make room for further landings and South Vietnamese refugees. Families were separated, with some making it onto the helicopters while others were left behind. People would even give up their children to strangers in hopes that they would be taken to safety. Operation Frequent Wind concluded as the largest helicopter-only evacuation in history, along with being one of the most intense and chaotic. The last helicopter left the embassy rooftop just before 8 a.m. local time on April 30, 1975, carrying the last of the Marine security guards. Some Marines were told that they would be required to stay and die fighting, but were ultimately able to return home. Once the last American helicopter left the U.S. Embassy, Saigon was left to its fate. Within hours, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the city, entering key areas with little to no resistance. The war was effectively over, but the political transformation of South Vietnam had just begun. At approximately 11:30 that same morning, the gates of the presidential palace were rushed by tanks, where the recently appointed South Vietnamese President Duong Van Minh awaited. Rather than fight, Van Minh announced the unconditional surrender of South Vietnam and the effective dissolution of the government in order to avoid further bloodshed. In the absence of bloodshed was the subsequent political reform of the country and its citizens. Re-education camps were set up across Vietnam where tens of thousands of former military officers, civil servants, and intellectuals were imprisoned for months, and even years. Private property was seized and businesses were nationalized, as the new communist government imposed centralized socialist policies. The press was censored, opposition was made illegal, and the cultural identity of South Vietnam was gradually erased. Thousands of people attempted to flee, but the borders were tightly controlled. In the following weeks, the U.S. Navy was able to rescue other refugees that had fled by sea, but would be unable to mount any further air or land evacuations. Following the collapse of Saigon, escape by boat was the only way for many to flee Vietnam. The overwhelming majority of South Vietnamese refugees fled the country by sea. Nicknamed the Boat People, these were Vietnamese refugees who escaped from the newly established communist government of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. They were fleeing political persecution, forced labor, and re-education camps. The refugees also included ethnic Chinese, also known as Hoa people, who were often targeted during purges and faced severe discrimination. Former South Vietnamese officials, military personnel, and those heavily associated with the United States and other Western organizations also left the country. In Operation New Life, U.S. Navy ships took in over 100,000 refugees, temporarily relocating them to Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines before resettlement. In Operation New Arrivals, Vietnamese refugees were able to resettle in the United States. The initial South Vietnamese refugees were brought to the United States and processed through military bases. Many were sponsored by American families, churches, and aid organizations under the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1975. The journey for the Vietnamese refugees was a dangerous one. Refugees often fled in small, overcrowded, often unseaworthy boats, typically fishing vessels, often faced with pirate attacks. Boats frequently capsized as a result of storms and turbulent weather. Refugees faced starvation, dehydration, and disease along the way. It is estimated between 200,000 to 400,000 people lost their lives at sea. The Boat People crisis was one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. The world was initially unprepared for the large influx of refugees. They were often placed in camps while awaiting resettlement. Between 1975 and 1995, over 1.5 million people fled Vietnam, with tens of thousands leaving immediately after the fall of Saigon. The second wave was even larger, occurring a few years later in the late 70s, due to harsh communist rule and tensions with neighboring countries. It is estimated that the United States accepted over 800,000 Vietnamese refugees, who have now built thriving diaspora communities, contributing significantly to the culture of the United States. After 20 years of fighting, the Vietnam War was finally over, and even further, after over 100 years of colonization and foreign involvement, this very moment would make Vietnam a fully independent nation. Many South Vietnamese would be arrested, executed, or sent to re-education camps. Entire families were separated. Generations of Vietnamese grew up dealing with the psychological scars of war, loss, and trauma. Following the fall of Saigon, the country would shift into communist rule, with a formal reunification occurring on July 2, 1976. Saigon would be renamed to Ho Chi Minh City, to commemorate the revolutionary leader who spent his entire life fighting for Vietnamese independence. Vietnam would remain aligned with the Soviet bloc for another decade, until the failure of its command economy led to the Doi Moi reforms in 1986. These reforms liberated the Vietnamese economy, opening the country to foreign investment. It would take 20 years following the fall of Saigon for diplomatic and economic relations to be fully normalized between the United States and Vietnam. All in all, 58,000 Americans and 2 million Vietnamese lost their lives in the conflict. Vietnam veterans returned to the United States battling PTSD, addiction, and for some, losing the battle with depression. Many American veterans struggled with the lack of support from their fellow Americans due to the unpopularity of the war amongst the general public. The image of the helicopter atop the U.S. Embassy remains today as a symbol of American defeat and abandonment. The fall of the city represented the failure of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and led to years of reevaluation of foreign intervention policy, something widely known today as Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam War would force future U.S. government officials to thoroughly evaluate the circumstances of a conflict before committing ground troops. Clear objectives, exit strategies, and public support would need to be confirmed. This day marks not just the fall of Saigon, but the collapse of South Vietnam. Today, April 30th is a public holiday in Vietnam. For some Vietnamese, especially in the diaspora, April 30th is seen as a day of mourning and resentment, as it marked the end of the Republic of Vietnam, a country that rejected communist rule. For many Vietnamese, it is a day of national pride, a day that culminated in the liberation of the country from Western intervention and established a unified, communist Vietnam. The evacuation of Saigon was not a clean operation. It was a desperate rescue amid the total collapse of a nation, with helicopters flying overhead, crowds pleading at the gates, and the world watching a global superpower see its long, costly war end in chaos.